So who enforces the DSA? Who enforces all these different rules? We have two basic channels of enforcement. First is public enforcement. Second is private enforcement. So public enforcement is done by national regulators known as digital services coordinators. But these national regulators sometimes can be sharing the responsibility with some other entities, because it's up to the national law to decide if maybe some of the obligations from the DSA are supervised by other authority than the DSC. But the DSC is always the main place that coordinates the enforcement. So apart from the national regulators, the DSA, parts of the DSA are also enforced by the European Commission. And we'll discuss when that's the case in a second. Second route for the enforcement is private enforcement. There's much less about private enforcement in the DSA, but in practice this can become quite significant. So DSA can be enforced by consumer organizations. There's a provision in DSA that says consumer organizations can take the DSA, and if there's a collective interest of consumers that is impacted, they can go and sue potentially for injunctions and other types of remedies. DSA can also be potentially enforced through the local law by companies or individuals. So the enforcement of the DSA through private means is also quite important. That part of the enforcement does not work according to the rules that I'll just discuss now, because that works according to the rules of international private law. So the jurisdiction of the courts is not constrained by how public authorities, when they're enforcing the DSA, are constrained. So how are public authorities constrained? So the deal the DSA offers is that there's only one authority that is responsible for a service. So the company, by its place of establishment, decides who the regulator is. So if it establishes itself in Ireland, then it's the Irish DSC that is solely responsible. Now, that solely has exception when it comes to very large online platforms, because in those cases, the national regulator will share the enforcement with the European Commission. But if we're talking about everyone but these very large online platforms or very large search engines, there's exclusive competence of one DSC per member state. So how does it work? Well, for EU companies, the key question is if there are several entities that potentially are responsible for the service, which of them is the main one? If there's one, then that's also the main one. And then in that case, that's the place of establishment, and that's the place where the regulator is. For the non-EU companies, it depends. Do they have some establishment in Europe? Maybe they have part of a business that is also responsible, some entity that is also responsible for the service, in which case that would become the establishment, even though globally it's by far not the main establishment. And in a situation where they don't have any establishment at all, they don't have any corporate presence at all in Europe, they can they have to appoint a legal representative, and legal representative then by its own establishment decides who the regulator is. So Telegram, for instance, decided to pick Belgian legal representative because they're based in Dubai. So thereby the Belgian DSC becomes responsible. So what happens if a non-EU service does not appoint a legal representative and does not have a local establishment in Europe? Well, the outcome is that any of the regulators is able to supervise violations of the DSA and enforce them on the first come, first served basis. So in case we have a service that is provided in the EU and there's no legal representative, basically any of the regulators can decide to move first, and they will then have the jurisdiction over that specific violation, which is obviously not very advantageous for the companies and should motivate them to appoint a legal representative, because ultimately they can face legal supervision in 27 member states. So to understand how the competencies are allocated between these different organizations in the different countries, we need to distinguish the companies. So if we're talking about a typical company, not a very large online platform, typical companies are only regulated by the place of establishment of the provider or the place of establishment of the legal representative. If we're talking about very large online platforms, then the issue is more complicated. So first of all, the rule is digital service coordinators are exclusively competent for the supervision of typical providers. So online platforms, hosting services, mere conduit caching services. So for those, it's always the DSCs of establishment that is responsible. And that's a one regulator per the whole of the EU. But in case we have a very large online platform or very large search engine that is designated as such through the European Commission, then from the point of designation, also European Commission gains the powers to supervise. And then essentially the European Commission will be empowered to enforce and supervise the whole of DSA along with the DSC. So all the obligations related to content moderation, risk management, they would share, but the top obligations, special obligations, will be then something that only the Commission is able to supervise. So for those, the Commission will have the exclusive competence. In other words, when your local online platforms becomes a very large online platform, you lose exclusivity to supervise it as a local authority because you start sharing it with the European Commission. Plus, the European Commission has priority in this shared relationship. But there are certain things that only the Commission can supervise. These are special obligations that we find in Section 5, Chapter 3 of the DSA, such as the access to data for researchers or the whole risk management system. So that's only these are the kind of obligations that only the European Commission can eventually supervise.